Hello history fans, today I'm going to talk about Boudica, and if you're over here from TikTok because you're here for the bedtime history vibes, then you can skip to the end where I'm going to be reading Tacitus, but if you want to hear all about the warrior woman, then keep on watching. So Boudica's story has become sort of mythologised as she's more representative of a movement and she's like a feisty feminist icon, when in reality it's more likely she was just a barbaric warrior whose story is that of a woman out for vengeance. Her fame in history is because she did lead a national rebellion that nearly threw the Romans out of Britain, and it was led by a woman, which is why it was so impressive. But in reality, we don't know much about her. She enters history in around 60 or 61 AD, and we don't have any knowledge of her age or her previous life. Some guesses say that she might have been a druid, or she might have been a priestess, but we do know she was married to Tacitus. The Isini Tribe were a small tribe in East Anglia or Norfolk, so the south of Britain, and all the surrounding tribes were working with the Romans, so it's most likely she did witness the first Roman invasion of Britain by Claudius in 43 AD. The previous king had agreed a client kingship with the Romans, which meant they left them alone to carry on with their lives, but there was then a rebellion, which meant the Romans disarmed the tribe and took away their king, replacing him with Tacitus. So Boudica is then just put into this position of somewhat authority, but she has to work with the Romans, but she would be living the best kind of life for a Celt. The Roman historian Tacitus tells us that when he dies, Tacitus left half of his throne to Nero and the other half to his two daughters in order to try and keep the peace. But the Romans seized the opportunity to make the Isini actually part of their empire, and they had started treating them like slaves rather than allies. The Romans entered the tribe and raped her two daughters. They then stripped and thrashed Boudica, humiliating her through gendered violence that takes away her kingdom, her and her daughter's honour, and their standing as human beings. So it's not only a physical assault, but it's also psychological, religious and political within the whole Celtic culture. This humiliation was in course intended to force her into submission, but it actually creates her power, and apparently she said, "The Romans have become so imperious that not even the body of a princess or a child is safe, so the Celts must fight back." Now, before we get into all the battles and the fighting and everything, I wanted to do some fun facts that I found quite interesting. So firstly is that Tacitus's name might just mean leader, so it might have been a stage name. And her name, Boudica, is part of the Celtic language, so it would have been pronounced in such a way, and it actually means victory in Celtic, so it may have not actually been her name, but it's something that was given to her during or after her time in history. Tacitus's spelling of her name is where we get the different pronunciations from, but most academics now agree on Boudica, as they think Boudicca was a misreading of the previous Latin text translations, and in the Celtics it would have been spelt with one C, but that wasn't very important to them because most of them were illiterate. Sadly, she wouldn't have had a war chariot with spikes, but the Celtic war chariots were actually pretty intimidating, even though they were just a chariot with two wheels that would have held Boudica and the two men below her who were passing her spears. Cassius Dio actually describes her hair essentially as really blonde, so she's possibly not the famous redhead that you've all come to love, because the word he uses to describe her hair is xanthitatus, which is the same word used to describe the sun or lions, so make of that colour what you will. But Cassius Dio also gives us the most barbaric description of her anyway, so when she appears she's got her massive lion hair down and she's wearing this huge torque around her neck, and he essentially says she's very tall and ugly. In ancient British culture, women could hold these positions of power, so even though she didn't have any military training, they believed she had power through her links to the gods through being queen. And then when she did become such a ferocious and powerful leader, it became clear she maybe did have a military mind when she planned to attack the three main places of Romans' place in Britain, which is Colchester, London and Verulamium. The Celt style of fighting may have taken the organised Romans by surprise because they were so chaotic and they came out naked and painted. They took the Romans by surprise, and overall it's believed there were at least 70,000 Roman casualties. And in the end she was only one battle away from the Romans having to withdraw from Britain, but ultimately in planned hand-to-hand combat the Romans won. So at the start of her rebellion, she's not really considered a real threat by the Roman Empire because the Isini were a relatively small tribe and arguably she wasn't their real queen, but this all changed at Colchester. Colchester was the biggest Roman settlement and they had just built a brand new temple to the divine Claudius, and this is where the Trinovantes had focused their power base. So when the Trinovantes ultimately joined Boudica and Boudica burns the temple to the ground, it really damages the Romans. So when the local consul finds out about Boudica's rebellion, he sends 200 unarmed troops to just hide in the temple because he thinks they won't be a threat. So there's 200 troops and possibly 1,000 of the women and children who live in the temple anyway, just hiding there waiting for Boudica. There's a 2-day siege, but eventually Boudica's men take it by storm and the whole building is made from wattle and daub, so it just burns down really easily. So this is the first time her rebellion is seen as a real threat to Rome, and that the Celts believe they might actually be able to overthrow the Romans. Now beforehand, all the different tribes in Britain competed with each other for land, resources, trading routes, whatever, but this higher cause of getting rid of the Romans joins them all together and she begins to gather more followers. At this point, the governor Gaius Suetonius Paulinus is in Anglesey killing the Druids because the Romans hated the Druids and they were the group of people that the Celts relied on for most of their political issues. So he's over there and Boudica goes to London and burns it to the ground. Now when he hears of this, he marches his 2 legions, his 10,000 troops back to London, but he rides ahead and finds London just completely on fire. And he evacuates a few people but doesn't bother too much because Boudica has just killed everyone, which is one reason that when we push her as a feminist icon, it's like, well, yes, stand up for yourself, but she did just slaughter everyone. People were really terrified of her and her inhumane methods because Cassius Dio tells us that she used to behead babies and that she actually strung up Roman women and cut off their boobs and tied them to their mouths. Obviously we're not sure how reliable that is, but people were scared of her. And Tacitus tells us that she was the only woman who fought with them, and instead she brought the women and children in carts along to watch the battles instead. Now at this point, the 9th Legion are on the way down from Lincolnshire. Now this is a group of 4,000 men or 3,000 cavalry who are Britain's elite Roman fighters, so the best fighters they have. But Boudica intercepts them and just wipes them out, which is a magnificent thing to accomplish. So they either ambush them, and because they were marching in formation, they just ambush them from all sides and wipe them out, or the Romans just massively underestimated her powers again, either their numbers or their fighting style. So she wipes out the 9th Legion, which is very, very impressive. Now this massively hits the Roman ego because they don't lose legions and they don't lose battles. So Paulinus then gathers all the men he can, which isn't very many, and he marches to Verulamium, which is now St Albans, with 10,000 men to try and fight Boudicca. And when he gets there, it's on fire. So he decides to go with a more military plan and he draws Boudicca to Watling Street. And if you know, I'm sure you all know about the battle, but it's a thin valley and he traps them essentially because Boudicca, we believe, had about 10 times the amount of people on her side. Now interestingly, we don't actually know where Watling Street is, and there's a lot of places that claim to be it, but both Watling and Street as words are Saxon words, so this famous association actually came years after. But Paulinus' plan is to get them into a valley, which is what Watling Street is, and when they go in, there is then a forest behind them so they can't retreat. He has his infantry in the middle of the valley and his cavalry on the top on both sides, so Boudicca and her men are swamped from all sides, and the people at the back of her army keep marching forward and essentially just crush their own people. And if they turn around and try to escape, the women and children on carts are in the way, so they just can't get out. Tacitus tells us that 80,000 Brits died and only 400 Romans. Now, even though this possibly isn't true, it shows us how much of a victory this was for the Romans and how much of a real threat Boudicca showed them, which is very impressive on her behalf. We don't really know how she died, and I think it's Dio who gives her death by poison because it's a weak, girly way to go, as opposed to nobly and bravely dying in battle. But of course the Romans did have to create a story powerful enough to justify them losing a whole legion and almost being kicked out of Britain. So the whole story we have to take with a pinch of salt, because as we know, history is written by the victors. Even Tacitus' history is literary, so as we know, nothing can be taken as objective fact, so even though he is our closest source to her, he can't be reliable. and some say he actually twists her story into the rape of Lucretia, so that's one reason we can't take it word for word, but also in his history every woman seems to go power mad and cruel, so we have to be careful what we believe about Boudica. In his work it becomes less about her story and more about the tyrannical leaders of Rome that Tacitus hates, and they're just not as good as his emperors now. So her barbariousness or her cruelty might be hidden or not spoken about as much because the writer has other motives, which we could argue throughout all of her retellings, because even though yes she was a very powerful military leader who almost conquered the Romans, she was also a very cruel woman. But whether it's Tacitus or modern feminists twisting her story, we can gather some key points about her. She does teach us bravery and to stand up for what you believe in, and apparently she inspired both Queen Elizabeth I and Victoria within their own reigns. So she is a good woman's role model in that respect, but she's also a barbaric killer equal to men in history that we most likely hate or very strongly dislike for their actions and the amount of deaths they caused. But she's important as representing those who stand up against injustice, and the Romans did treat her absolutely horrifically, so really she's quite justified, and the Romans brought it upon themselves. And almost defeating the Romans was no easy task, so she's a very impressive and powerful lady, and of course she's one of the few important women in history we do actually hear about in school or just in life, so it is important to keep retelling her story, but we need to try and find her voice within it rather than the men who wrote the histories. And now I'm going to read Tacitus' recount of the story of Boudica. So this is from page 328 of my Penguin translation. While Suetonius was thus occupied, he learnt of a sudden rebellion in the province. Prasutagus, king of the Isini, after a long and renowned prosperity, had made the emperor co-heir with his own 2 daughters. Prasutagus hoped by this submissiveness to preserve his kingdom and household from attack, but it turned out otherwise. Kingdom and households alike were plundered like prizes of war, the one by Roman officers, the other by Roman slaves. As a beginning, his widow Boudica was flogged and their daughters raped. The Icenian chiefs were deprived of their hereditary estates as if the Romans had been given the whole country. The king's own relatives were treated like slaves. And the humiliated Iceni feared still the worse, now that they had been reduced to provincial status, so they rebelled. With them rose the Trinobantes and others. Servitude had not broken them, and they had secretly plotted together to become free again. They particularly hated the Roman ex-soldiers who had recently established a settlement at Camulodonium, which is Colchester. The settlers drove the Trinobantes from their home and land and called them prisoners and slaves. The troops encouraged the settlers' outrages, since their own way of behaving was the same, and they looked forward to similar license for themselves. Moreover, the temple erected to the divine Claudius was a blatant stronghold of alien rule, and its observances were a pretext to make the natives appointed as its priests drained the whole country dry. It seemed easy to destroy the settlement, for it had no walls. That was a matter which Roman commanders, thinking of amenities rather than needs, had neglected. At this conjuncture, for no visible reason, the statue of Victory at Camulodonium fell down, with its back turned as though it were fleeing the enemy. Delirious women chanted of destruction at hand. They cried that in the local Senate House outlandish yells had been heard. The theatre had echoed with shrieks. At the mouth of the Thames a phantom settlement had been seen in ruins. A blood-red colour in the sea, too, and shapes like human corpses left by the ebb tide were interpreted hopefully by the Britons, and with terror by the settlers. Suetonius, however, was far away, so they appealed for help to the imperial agent Catus Decianus. He sent them barely 200 men, incompletely unarmed. There was also a small garrison on the spot. Reliance was placed on the temple's protection. Misled by secret pro-rebels who hampered their plans, they dispensed with rampart or trench. They omitted also to evacuate old people and women, and thus leave only fighting men behind. Their precautions were appropriate to a time of unbroken peace. Then a native horde surrounded them. When all else had been ravaged or burnt, The garrison concentrated itself in the temple. After 2 days' siege, it fell by storm. The 9th Roman Division, commanded by Quintus Petilius, Cerealius, Caesius Rufus, attempted to relieve the town, but was stopped by the victorious Britons and routed. Its entire infantry force was massacred, while the commander escaped to his camp with his cavalry and sheltered behind its defences. The imperial agent Catus Decianus, horrified by the catastrophe and by his unpopularity, withdrew to Gaul. It was his rapacity which had driven the province to war. But Suetonius, undismayed, marched through disaffected territory to Londinium. This town did not rank as a Roman settlement, but was an important centre for businessmen and merchandise. At first he hesitated whether to stand and fight there. Eventually his numerical inferiority, and the price only too clearly paid by the divisional commander's rashness, decided him to sacrifice the single city of Londinium to save the province as a whole. Unmoved by lamentations and appeals, Suetonius gave the signal for departure. The inhabitants were allowed to accompany him, but those who stayed, because they were women or old, or attached to the place, were slaughtered by the enemy. Verulamium suffered the same fate. The natives enjoyed plundering and thought of nothing else. Bypassing forts and garrisons, they made for where loot was richest and protection weakest. Roman and provincial deaths at the places mentioned are estimated at 70,000. For the British did not take or sell prisoners, or practice other wartime exchanges. They could not wait to cut throats, hang, burn, and crucify, and though avenging, in advance, the retribution that was on its way. Suetonius collected the 14th Brigade and detachments of the 20th, together with the nearest available auxiliaries, amounting to nearly 10,000 armed men, and decided to attack without further delay. He chose a position in a defile with a wood behind him. There could be no enemy, he knew, except at his front, where there was an open country without cover for ambushes. Suetonius drew up his regular troops in close order, with the light arms auxiliaries at their flanks and the cavalry massed on the wings. On the British side, cavalry and infantry bands seethed over a wide area in unprecedented numbers. Their confidence was such that they brought their wives with them to see the victory, installing them in carts stationed at the edge of the battlefield. Just to say, when I say Suetonius, we now call him Paulinus, I think, but obviously I said his full name was Suetonius Gaius Paulinus, so that's who I'm talking about. Boudica drove round all the tribes in a chariot with her daughters in front of her. "We British are used to women commanders in war," she cried. "I am descended from mighty men, but now I am not fighting for my kingdom and wealth. I am fighting as an ordinary person for my lost freedom, my bruised body, and my outraged daughters. Nowadays, Roman rapacity does not even spare our bodies. Old people are killed, virgins raped, but the gods will grant us the vengeance we deserve. The Roman division which dare to fight is annihilated. The other cower in their camps, or watch for a chance to escape. They will never face even the din and roar of all our thousands, much less the shock of our onslaught. Consider how much of you are fighting, and why. Then you will win this battle or perish. That is what I, a woman, plan to do. Let the men live in slavery if they will." Suetonius trusted his men's bravery, yet he too, at this critical moment, offered encouragements and appeals. "Disregard the clamorous and empty threats of the natives," he said. "In their ranks there are more women than fighting men. Unwarlike, unarmed, when they see the arms and courage of the conquerors who have routed them so often, they will break immediately. Even when a force contains many divisions, few among them win the battles. What special glory for your small numbers to win the renown of a whole army. Just keep in close order, throw your javelins, and then carry on. Use shield bosses to fell them, swords to kill them. Do not think of plunder. When you have won, you will have everything." The general's words were enthusiastically received. The old battle-experienced soldiers longed to hurl their javelins. So Suetonius confidently gave the signal for battle. At first the regular troops stood their ground, keeping to the defile as a natural defence. They launched their javelins accurately at the approaching enemy. Then, in wedge formation, they burst forward. So did the auxiliary infantry. The cavalry, too, with lances extended, demolished all serious resistance. The remaining Britons fled with difficulty since their ring of wagons blocked the outlets. The Romans did not spare even the women. Baggage animals, too, transfixed with the weapons, added to the heaps of dead. It was a glorious victory, comparable with bygone triumphs. According to one report, almost 80,000 Britons fell. Our own casualties were about 400 dead and a slightly larger number of wounded. Boudica poisoned herself. Poenius Posthumus, chief of staff of the 2nd Division, which had not joined Suetonius, learning of the success of the other two formations, stabbed himself to death because he had cheated his formation of its share in the victory and broken regulations by disobeying his commander's orders. The whole army was now united. Suetonius kept it under canvas to finish the war. The emperor raised its numbers by transferring from Germany 2,000 regular troops, which brought the 9th Division to full strength, also 8 auxiliary infantry battalions and 1,000 cavalry. These were stationed together in new winter quarters, and hostile or wavering tribes were ravaged with fire and sword. But the enemy's worst affliction was famine, for they had neglected to sow their fields and brought everyone available into the army, intending to seize our supplies. Still, the savage British tribesmen were disinclined for peace, especially as the newly arrived imperial agent Gaius Julius Alpinius Classicianus, successor to Catus Decianus, was on bad terms with Suetonius, and allowed his personal animosities to damage the national interest, for he passed around advice to wait for a new governor who would be kind to those who surrendered, without an enemy's bitterness or a conqueror's arrogance. Classicianus also reported to Rome that there was no prospect of ending the war unless a successor was appointed to Suetonius, whose failures he attributed to perversity and his successors to luck.